All right, welcome everybody. We are excited to be, continuing our sustainability and resilience virtual gathering series. We're really excited that you're joining us. And we're going to get started in just a minute. As you come in, please include your name, your email, and the group you're with in the chat function. As before, we will take questions in the chat function, and just feel free to submit them as you think of them, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end for question and answer. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So this is about pest management, and I'm gonna turn it over to Dan and Tyler, who will be presenting how to manage pests that might show up in your garden.
And I'm the Regional Food Systems Coordinator here, and recently I've been working a little more in the garden, so hoping we can share some good information with you today.
So today we're going to be talking about pests, and we'll unravel exactly what that means in a moment. First of all, I want to say happy summer to everyone. I hope you've all been enjoying these beautiful days. We're getting to the point where we're really in lush growth. We're really starting to harvest quite a bit. The flowers are out, the insects are out, the wildlife is out. This is the time of the season when we often really start to have issues with various insects and animals, herbivores, humans as well, coming in and sometimes over harvesting. So today we're going to be talking about how do we find that balance. That's so important, right? As gardeners, whether we're growing flowers, vegetables, fruit, whatever it might be, we all are there because we care about nature, because we want to create a beautiful and fecund landscape around us. We want to do our part. So today we're going to be talking about how do we go through some of those thorny issues where sometimes wildlife takes a little bit more than their fair share. So we'll talk about preventative techniques. We'll talk about what to do if there is a large infestation of anything. And more importantly, we're going to be really focusing on the deep organic approaches, the permaculture approaches, so that we can prevent those problems before they become issues that we need to deal with toxic pesticides, which we want to try to avoid at all times. So first of all, let's talk about what is a pest, right? That word has so much connotations. And right, we call someone a pest when they're annoying us. But really, if we think about what it is, it's a category generally referring to insects, animals, bacteria, fungi, and viruses that can decimate whatever plants we might want to be growing. And of course, just like weeds, this is an extremely subjective category. And I think that's a really important note to make, that oftentimes what we might think of as a pest might actually be having a lot of beneficial impacts. In fact, I would argue that all life is inherently valuable and beneficial. Of course, sometimes we have competing interests with what that life might be eating. So today I want to talk a little bit about how we might step back and really assess what is happening, what is a pest, how do we know that something is a pest, and what do we do about it? It's really, really important questions, right? Because the way that we manage our landscapes ultimately adds up into the approach that we as humans take to managing wildlife. And Tyler is going to be talking a little bit later about just the important impacts that we as humans have made on insects and other wildlife as well over decades. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of the impacts of that right now. So I'm going to hand it off to Tyler. He's going to talk a little bit about what exactly that paradigm shift might look like.
So yeah, to pick up where Dan left off, And if you've attended Dan's past talks in the garden, including the compost one, including the weeding one, we really want to try to focus this discussion on pests and shift away from the idea of that it's always this, pest warfare. It's not always, you versus the bad guy. It's if you can take a minute, see what plants you have, see what animals you have, and see how everything might work together, then maybe you can make the system work. Maybe you don't have to intervene. Maybe things will sort of, figure out itself. Things will find its balance, maybe with a little push over here from your direction, but like Dan mentioned, maybe not just, spraying your whole patch with a pesticide in order to get rid of one of the bugs there that you don't like. And this idea of shifting the paradigm away from what a pest might be, it does have broader implications because, right now there's this term that people are applying, like the insect apocalypse, which is something that has been going on, something that we can measure, both scientifically, but also there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people have been experiencing as well, of sort of just this mass die-off of the sheer volume of insects you'd expect to see. So a good example that many people are familiar with are for honeybees and our other pollinators experiencing colony collapse disorder. But anecdotally, and I've even heard this, from my parents, people my parents' age remember going on a road trip and having to clean their windshield off multiple times from insects. And yeah, that's just a few people's stories, but I haven't had to do that. And I think that, there's something there. There's something to say about that. And one of the things that we want to touch on today of maybe a small way that you can sort of, shift that narrative away from cleaning out all of your insects is to maybe move away from those spray pests. But we also should be acknowledging the different factors that go into this potential insect apocalypse, like climate change and rapid urbanization that, contributes to their habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. I do have an example here of one thing that I wanted to show to sort of highlight something that we see in the garden that is, potentially a pest, and then kind of reframe it to point out the positives of it and how it might be beneficial instead of something that we should be working to get rid of. And over here, this is one of the many currant plants that we have in the garden. This one, if it's showing up on the sign, is a pink champagne currant, and you can see it is loaded with fruits that will be ripening up. But the thing that I wanted to point out is you can see on quite a number of these leaves that there is damage on these. This is, I think, a pretty good example of a damaged leaf, and there are numbered throughout. And this is caused by these very, very small insects, mostly aphids in here, that are eating away by sort of injecting and pulling out some of the nutrients from the plant. But one thing that's important to note is these aphids on this current plant are not being treated against. There's nothing being sprayed on this. And so they kind of have the room to grow and sort of kill off a couple of these leaves. But confirmed by Dan, this plant hasn't seen any drop off of fruit production. It's still thriving. And this is a great example of understanding what these, pests are on this plant, what's causing it to look a little ugly, but realizing that these aphids are actually a good food source for some of the carnivorous insects in the garden that we do want to see around, like, dragonflies or ladybugs, one of the things that you'd like to spot. They're feeding off of these, and it's sort of taking this idea of seeing everything as a complete system, and that pulling one of those things away can have impacts down the line. And I will be talking a little bit more later on about the downstream impacts of, particularly of some chemical sprays, some insecticides. But before we do that, I think I'll swing it back over to Dan, and we can talk about some of the preventative measures instead of treating after the fact or when you might have pest issues.
Thank you, Tyler. So let's talk about some of the first principles that we really need to be considering to prevent pest issues in the first place. The first one I want to talk about is the importance of observation before intervention, right? Before we start getting all the big guns out, going after whatever might be nibbling or chewing on some leaf or a flower that we care about. Let's step back and just observe with a really calm mind without understanding of what might be happening and how we approach it. So I want to give you an example of why that's important. If you take a look over here for a moment, I walked into the garden this morning and I found that quite a few of our sunflowers have been nibbled quite severely, some of them almost all the way to the ground. And one thing that I've noticed, this is already the third summer in a row that this particular bed is getting nibbled. And we don't actually have that problem in some of our other beds. So one thing I'm noticing is that this edge seems to be much more prone to herbivores. And as I'm observing, I'm also asking the question of what's really going on here? What might be causing this? So for example, I'm noticing that these sunflowers, they were clearly bitten down. So I know that that's an animal, that's not an insect. And my guess, based on previous observations, is that it might be a resident woodchuck. I've seen woodchucks emerge very frequently from underneath our garden shed over there. So I know that woodchucks do live here. I've also seen a few rabbits here, although, again, my guess is that woodchuck just to get through observation. So once I've made that observation, only then can I really start to think about what might be the right practice. And one thought I have, before I even get into kind of some of these physical barriers, which we'll talk about later, is maybe next time we plant this bed out, maybe we'll really think about what plants would not be of interest to herbivores in the first place, since we know that they're coming in here very frequently. So perhaps next time we plant this bed out, I'll plant something like garlic or onions that I know have absolutely no interest for herbivores. So those are the kinds of observations that I make. I tend to also keep a nature journal, a garden journal, so that I can start to see those patterns emerge. I also really like to note when I start to see certain insect pests appear so that I know roughly what time of year to expect them. And oftentimes what that allows me to do is to miss that first wave. So this year, and I'm going to start to do this in future years, I've been planting potatoes out much later in the season because I've noticed that that helps to prevent that first wave of Colorado potato beetles. We still have a few, and I'll show you actually what those look like later on, but much, much fewer than usual because we planted much later than usual, so we missed that first wave. So that's the kind of information that you might start to gather over time. That's the first important principle. The second important principle I want to talk about is the importance of diversity. We talk about diversity so often in organic and permaculture circles, and I want to really think about diversity that we can bring in to the soil, so below ground, as well as above ground. And when I'm talking about diversity, I'm not just talking about different plants. Certainly that's important. I'm also talking about temporal diversity, so meaning over time, the diversity. So for example, I want to be thinking about having something in flower throughout the entire season. That's temporal diversity. I want to be also thinking about habitat diversity. So having overstory, right? So trees, as well as shrubs and tall grasses, those are all going to harbor different kinds of beneficial insects as well as animals that are going to really reduce pest populations without our intervention. Trying to find that balance. When it comes to below ground diversity, we're really talking about soil health. The same principles we'd be using for any general soil health is what we'd be thinking about in terms of pest prevention as well. So we want to be thinking about adding a lot of organic matter, whether that's in the form of compost, green manures, cover crops, organic mulches. Those all add a lot of biological diversity below ground. They bring in the earthworms, the nematodes, the bacteria, the fungi, all of which are really, really important to help creating healthy plants. And really when we're talking about pest management, the most important thing I want to get across is that what we really need to do is grow healthy plants. All plants have their own immune systems, just like we do. Of course, their immune systems function a little differently. They function primarily through a chemical response. So for example, the reason that mint or lemon balm or oregano smell the way they do is because they're creating those aromatic compounds as an immune response to prevent pests from eating them. And as long as we really focus on plant health, we're going to prevent the vast majority of problems. In general, what I've noticed over time is that we only have really big pest outbreaks on plants that are not healthy. And how do I know a plant isn't healthy? Well, of course, I mean, the appearance of it will tell you quite a bit, right? Whether it looks droopy, whether the leaves might be yellowing or purpling. Those are all signs of unhealthy plants. What creates lack of health? Like, could be a lot of different things. Certainly the right plant in the right place is essential, right? So if a plant particularly likes dry conditions, let's say something like rosemary, really likes dry, sandier soils. If you plant it in a wet spot, you're going to be inviting pests because it's going to be a weakened plant. So really important that you get the right plant in the right place. Of course, you want to treat your plants well. If it's injured or damaged, that's going to invite pests. They can sense that really, really well. So really important to focus on plant health and vigor. If you have that vigor, you're not going to be dealing with nearly the same amount of pest issues. I also want to talk about the importance of rotating where we plant things. Of course, that's really primarily focusing on annual plants, plants that you need to plant from seed or transplant every single season. Perennials, we are not rotating. We'd have to dig them up. That would be really intrusive. So our trees, our shrubs, our herbaceous perennials like herbs, we're not rotating those around. But we certainly are rotating all of our annuals because otherwise you end up with this buildup, right? Pests often will overwinter in the soil. Talking about insects in particular, will overwinter as well as fungi and viruses. So if you rotate plant families or types of plants, you're going to be really reducing the amount of outbreaks that can develop. So really, really important, especially if you know that you have soil-borne pathogens or insects of some kind, to rotate your crops regularly. Let's talk about how to attract beneficial, right? This is a question I get asked a lot in this garden. How do we attract beneficial insects? Because again, we really want to be thinking about this from a permaculture perspective where the problem is the solution. By which I mean that if our problem is that we have too many insect pests eating the crops that we're trying to harvest, whether it's for flowers or for food or for medicine, whatever it might be, we want to be thinking about how do we attract predators, right? That's the solution. That's the natural balance that we're trying to aim for. It's never going to be perfect, right? Bringing in beneficials won't eliminate pests, but it will bring it into more or less what that right balance looks like. And that right balance is going to be different for all of us. In our garden, we relatively think of the right balance as being a 20% loss, whether it's to animal or insect, fungal or bacterial pests, or human pests. People over-harvesting is a problem in our gardens occasionally. So we want to be thinking about what that threshold is, and that beneficial, usually bringing in beneficials that help us kind of get to that area where we're losing a little bit, but just enough that we still have plenty for ourselves, right? We want to share that surplus. So problem is the solution, really important. How do we attract beneficials? Of course, when we already talked about the importance of habitat, so that really means perennials. Having a perennial backbone in a garden is so important. Even if you're just growing vegetables every year, I highly recommend a perennial backbone. So that could be a hedgerow. That could be a perennial pathway that you're lining with various flowering plants, shrubs, maybe small trees even, ornamental grasses, cover crops, whatever it might be, something that's going to really create habitat for your spiders, your stink bugs, which are also predatory insects, your various wasps. There's so many plants that need those habitat spaces. That's really important. I also really want to stress the importance of using smaller flowering, less gaudy flowers. So important. So a lot of times, in our ornamental gardens, we're growing things like roses, hydrangeas, lilacs, peonies, all beautiful flowers that I really do love. However, those plants are mostly bred for big petals, showy, rosy, large petals that are beautiful to our eyes. But unfortunately, those plants tend not to be very attractive towards beneficial insects. Beneficial insects like wasps, like lady beetles, so many, they are looking for sources of nectar at some point in their life cycle. And they're generally drawn towards smaller flowers that are not quite as showy, and really drawn towards wilder forms as well. So not the cultivated varieties that tend to be larger and of different colors, but some that are a little bit less showy, but can often be equally or even more beautiful. So I want to show you a patch of our garden where we have a lot of those growing. So follow me. We're going to go towards our wildflower area of our garden. Attempt to walk backwards without killing myself here. We'll see how that goes. So we're passing through our vegetable garden. We're going to return here in a little bit to look at some of the specific insect pests, because I certainly don't want to give anyone the impression that we are free and clear of all insect and animal pressure. We certainly face quite a bit of that. So we're going to look at some of that and what exactly we're doing about it. And while I'm walking, I also want to invite you all to think about what problems you might be facing, so that in our Q&A session, you have an opportunity to ask some questions. So let's take a look here. So this is some of the edges of our garden. We talked about that perennial backbone. That's really what we have here, kind of around our primary vegetable growing area. Certainly we have a lot of edible plants here too. We have garlic chives. Over here behind us here, we have some sunchokes. So quite a bit of food being produced. And yet we also have plants that are in flower and creating habitat for our beneficials. So I'll give you a few examples of what we use. This is a plant called New Jersey tea. It's a native plant, and I don't know if you all can see this, but it is absolutely buzzing with life. I mean, just through a quick inspection, I can say I see probably 10 different species of different wasps and pollinators on here. A lot of those wasps go through multiple stages. They gather nectar, but they also eat a lot of insects. They eat aphids, they eat spider mites. A lot of them are going after tomato hornworms as well. So a lot of different issues. So again, these are small flowers. They're not very showy, but en masse, they're incredible. And more importantly, the show of pollinators and beneficial predatory insects on here is incredible. And it really, to me, it's one of the joys of gardening, is to see that life come into your space and sharing that space with others. We also have yarrow here, also smaller flowers. And if you notice a pattern, white flowers in particular seem to be a big draw, from my experience, for beneficial insects. And I want to highlight a few plant families in particular to really think about in terms of bringing in those beneficials. A lot of our aromatic herbs are fantastic at bringing in beneficials when they flower. Anything in the mint family is going to be fantastic. That's your mints, your lemon balm, your oregano, your rosemary, your thyme, so many other plants, motherwort, quite a few plants that when they flower are just going to be kind of, oh, just had a swallowtail butterfly come right by us. So really, really important to be thinking about those. I would also really stress the importance of anything in the carrot and parsley family. This is the umbelliferous family. They are fantastic when they flower. So your parsley, your carrot, your Queen Anne's lace, your yarrow, dill, cilantro, all of those plants are in the same family. They all have these kind of umbrella-like white flowers, and you can see them right here on this yarrow. And when they bloom, they are just an absolute magnet for beneficials. Truly, truly pumping out a lot of nectar. So I would really stress the importance of those. So really think about how you can be increasing the amount of beneficials in your landscape as you go. So with that, I want to bring it over to Tyler, because really the last resort that we want to think about is using toxic pesticides, right? And I really want to I want to mention this in the sense that there are organically approved toxic pesticides, and there are conventional, meaning non-organic toxic pesticides. And there is a substantial difference between them, and yet there's also a lot of similarities in the way that they function. So I'm going to let Tyler talk a little bit more about what pesticides actually do, when might be the right time to use them, and really what to consider as you're making those decisions. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So yes, I will touch on that because one of the things that I found really important to try to further understand why pesticides are used, how they're used, was really understanding on biological and the chemistry of actually what's going on. But real quick, I was just reminded while Dan was talking before I touch on that, another like ecological concept, and Dan did say this, but it's important to highlight that it's good to attract these beneficial insects or animals or things that help your garden, because one thing that I learned from a biology and ecology education was introducing those things, like introducing something to solve a pest, almost never works, and it almost always just becomes an invasive and spreads. I mean, everyone is familiar with invasive plants and animals at this point. There are success stories, don't get me wrong, but largely it's about attracting the things that in a natural system allow it to figure itself out rather than intervening. But to go back to the pesticides, one of the things that, and I guess I was pretty young when I first learned, but I was shocked to learn how a lot of these pesticides work, both the organic and the synthetic chemical ones. A lot of them work by attacking specifically the insects' neurotransmitters or their respiratory systems. And what it essentially does is if an insect eats a plant that has the insecticide in it, or they touch a plant that has the insecticide on it, their brain essentially is tricked into overfiring their synapses and their connections, and they literally just work themselves to death. And it sounds pretty graphic, it kind of is, but to highlight from that, the reason why we should see that as a last resort is because up until very, very recently, almost no pesticides can be, insect specific, because insects, though very diverse, they do fall under a large umbrella of relatedness, and they do have similar neurotransmitters, they have similar immune systems and respiratory functions. And so when a chemical is used to attack, say, one type of beetle's immune system, it's actually going to be attacking every other insect that comes into contact, or most every other insect that comes into contact with that plant as well. But to touch on a couple of the differences between organic and inorganic or synthetic, synthetic is exactly what it sounds like. These are pesticides that are derived in a lab and then used to do exactly what I had just discussed. And they are effective, no doubt, but they have a lot more longer lasting downstream effects, which is what I mentioned earlier I was going to talk about, and how a synthetic chemical that many people are familiar with now, I'm sure from Silent Spring and a lot of literature published on it, is DDT, and how that was used, at least in the US, it was the predominant insecticide that was used. And it wasn't found out until, years later that this process called biomagnification was occurring, and larger insects that were eating the insects that had eaten the DDT had a larger concentration. And then the birds that were eating those insects had a larger concentration of DDT. And then what really drew the end of the line for DDT was bald eagles, America's national bird, were not able to reproduce as well because DDT was actually thinning their shells, and they were crushing their young before they mature. And that is just one example, but that biomagnification is something that we do know a lot about, and it does occur. And that's why you hear about large fish having large amounts of mercury. That's the same process that is happening. And the difference for organic pesticides is a lot of them have a carbon backbone, a carbon base, which is how you biologically define something as being organic, is it's carbon based. And essentially these do a lot of the times work the same way. Chemicals such as like a neonicotinoid, which is like nicotine, like you would find in tobacco. These are chemicals that do negatively affect and can kill insects and be used as a treatment. And the idea behind using organic is, since they have a carbon backbone, many non-target organisms like us or our pets or the environment can pass these chemicals on more easily than insects can, and won't be as affected by them. But it's important to note that, we're touting this idea of using as a last resort, because even though you know, you can pass these organic pesticides better, they do still stick around. They might be able to not be as prolific as like a fat soluble synthetic that will stay in your body. You won't be able to pass it, but just to be knowledgeable that, you know, everything that you put in your garden is going to have a downstream effect, and the idea is to minimize what else you're impacting in this entire system.
Tyler, can you say just for a second, kind of, what is that moment of last resort?
Sure. I think that, and I will have Dan expand on this too, because I think he probably has more experience. But yeah, sure. I do think that if you take the approach of being more specific about what the actual problem is, and this is going to apply to pests even beyond a garden, so it could be like an invasive species project. You know, there are a lot of invasive species, as we talked about, hundreds of them, thousands of them in the area, but there are some that the federal and state government deems necessary to, you know, have a funded project to eradicate because of the long-term damage that they can do. And so in a garden, I don't necessarily have the specifics, but I think that on the same principle of, if you're seeing that this pest that you have might actually disrupt your entire system by eliminating the plant you're trying to grow, I think that could be an example of when you might, you know, transition to, you've got to get rid of it so that the whole system can.
Yeah, and that is a great question, that threshold question. You know, when do you take it to the next level? I mean, it's very much based on your individual ethics, of course. I generally tend to step back and observe first. And again, if you follow those first principles, hopefully you won't get to that. But in this garden, we don't use really any organic, certainly conventional, either pesticides of any kind. We have used insecticidal soap, which I'll talk about in a bit, which I guess could potentially be included in that category. But even that, I think we've only maybe used it once or twice ever before. So it's very rare. And again, if you get to that place of really good health, it's not going to be quite as much of an issue. But that threshold question is important. And so, for example, I want to show you a Woodchuck Burrow, which we just found, actually. We're here over in the sunchokes, also known as Jerusalem artichokes. And this threshold question has come up with us because I don't know if you all can see this in here, but there is a very large burrow in there. And I'm almost certain that that's a woodchuck. I've seen them skittering about. I've actually seen woodchucks even fighting in here recently, or making love. I wasn't quite sure. And they've been nibbling quite a bit. So over here, for example, I noticed that they just ate some of our beans, which we planted. And that's not surprising to me, again, given the condition. We're always making observations. What's going on right now? We're in a fairly, I wouldn't say moderate drought at this point. It hasn't really rained much at all in the last month or so. So animals are getting extremely thirsty. And oftentimes what they do when they're thirsty is they go after juicy morsels, whether that's fruit or sprouts. So we planted beans around all of these bean poles. You can see some of them germinated quite well, and some of them were just eaten right down to the ground. Now, what do I do in this case? Do I, dig up, maybe fill in that the woodchuck hole there? Maybe I sprinkle some chili peppers, which might deter them. That's a possibility. Or maybe because I know that beans will easily spring back up in a few more days if I plant them right now, and I still have plenty of time in the season, maybe I'll just replant right around here. And this time I'm going to use a physical barrier, because I know that it is most likely that woodchuck, to cover them so that they can get to a substantial size, by which point they won't be as juicy and succulent. And you can see over here, these beans aren't being touched. They are already quite a bit bigger. These are about 2 weeks old now. And at this point, they're just not as attractive to herbivores. They're toughened up, they're fibrous. So if I can get them to this point, I won't have to worry about herbivores anymore coming in, most likely. So I think that's what I'm going to do in this case. And again, that's kind of the thought process I'm thinking about, is what's the least amount of work that I have to do for the greatest impact on what we are looking for out of our garden without negative external effects, right? Least work for greatest effect. That's often how we refer to it, the permaculture principle. So let's get into a little bit more of in-depth about some of the specific insect pests, animal pests we're looking at. So we're going to walk over, take a look at a few issues that we're having right now in our veggies. And specifically, I want to show you all some of our tomatillos, which have been having a hard time recently. And I want to tell you a bit about how we're approaching that. So,
Dan, we lost your audio.
okay, so why don't we walk over to, here we are at the tomatillos, right over here. Yep. So, I'm sure you all are familiar with this plant.
We lost
tomatillos.
audio.
No audio.
No audio?
Yeah.
Can slow
we'll wait.
down for a second.
Let
Try
me know if you
again.
can hear me now.
Oh, can't hear you.
Keep trying to talk for a bit. How are we doing? Can you hear us now?
Try again, Dan.
Yes, can you hear us now?
No, I can't hear you. Hmm. Let's see. Oh, you can hear me, Dan.
Can you hear us now?
Okay, keep going. Maybe it's just me.
Okay, and definitely let me know, by the way, if you all have any questions as we talk. But I want to show you a couple issues that we're facing and talk about how we're approaching them. So we're at our tomatillos, one of our favorite fall, late summer fall crops. And we've never had any issues with our tomatillos before. But this year, we've been really facing a lot of issues with, oh, just left, I actually just saw one. It's called the three-striped, let me see if I can get one here. The three-striped potato beetle. They're all over, but even if we don't see them, first of all, I want you all to notice these holes here, right? So we started to notice these about 3 weeks ago, and truly these plants were decimated at that point. They were really, really struggling. And that's actually something that I want to point out. I wish I had even caught this earlier, because if you can catch a problem really, really early, you can often get away with just mechanical and cultural interventions as opposed to various sprays or chemical interventions. So we caught this a little bit later than I would have liked. It was a bit of a problem at that point. And my guess as to why this was happening, a few things. Well, first of all, our tomatillos are planted right next to our potatoes. Our potatoes, for some reason, don't seem to be struggling quite as much from that particular three-striped potato beetle, but they seem to have come over from the potatoes and really started to attack our tomatillos. So I did notice that they were getting attacked, and at that point, we used mechanical intervention, by which I mean we went in and we hand-picked them. And there's a really important point here that I want to make, which is that in observations, we started to note that what's really happening is that the adults are laying their eggs, which are these little orange guys. They look like tiny little caviar almost. And those eggs are then hatching out, and the pupa are then eating the leaves. That's the adults. So we did go through and we tried to squash the adults, and that worked fairly well. But very importantly, for once or twice a week for the last few weeks since we caught this, we've been going through and crushing the little eggs as well as the pupa. And you can see some of the pupa right there. They're kind of brown. They look kind of gross. So I just physically crush it with my finger like that. I'll go through. Again, it takes me a few minutes. I'm not looking to get every single egg, but certainly I want to try to get most of that population. And as these plants become more vigorous, as they get healthier, that problem is going to start to really become more minimal. Because again, most pests are looking for that young, succulent, supple growth. So as long as we can get these to a really good stage, they will start to become much more resilient of their own. That's really important because again, it's really about plant health. If a plant is not healthy, it will be immunosuppressed and much more vulnerable to attack. So I go through every morning I just crush a few eggs. I crush a few of these adults if I can. I just got one right there. You can drown them if you don't want to physically kill them yourself. You can just put them in water. And I know it's not fun, but honestly, part of gardening is making those decisions, and we do have to protect what we're growing here. Again, we're not killing all of them, and certainly, you know, we would like to have beneficial take care of the entire problem, but we do need to intervene in this case. And they've actually been doing much better since we started to do that. So that's one case, and we're doing the same thing here. If you look at our potatoes, we started to really scout carefully after we noticed that in the potatoes. And I actually noticed a different pest, which probably a lot of you experience if you do grow potatoes, which is the Colorado potato beetle. It is a merciless pest, and unfortunately does not have a lot of natural predators because it is, well, for one thing, it's not native. Of course, Colorado is where it was first discovered, but it doesn't seem to be of interest to a lot of predators. I believe that there are some birds that are interested in it. By the way, attracting birds is something that we are very interested in doing to control our insect pests. And let me do a quick tangent on birds. One way that we do that is by creating a lot of perches. And a really simple way, double duty, is by investing in some of these tomato stakes, which we use on all of our cubes, all of our tomatoes, tomatillos, a lot of our other plants that we support. The birds come, they land on them, and then they are able to hunt very successfully from those perches. We also really are interested in attracting bats as well. We have bat houses in our garden, but nonetheless, we still get some insects. And if you look over here, here's an example of a really, they're pretty gross insects. You can see it right there. They got some spots on them, and they're just nasty. But luckily, we caught them very early. Our potatoes are still quite healthy. So I'm going to go through. I really don't like, I'm probably going to just put them in water because when you squish them, they're juicy and it's gross. But it's part of the job of being a good gardener. And so that's what I'm going to do to protect our potatoes. And they should be fine. As long as I do that, spend 5 minutes a couple times a week, I should be able to protect them quite well. And I'm also, of course, looking for pupa underneath the leaves. Here's a great example of that. You can see some of the young right there. That's really what's causing the problem. So I certainly want to dispose of those. I will either drown them or otherwise dispose of them. I certainly wouldn't want to just take the leaf off and toss it on the ground. We really want to remove any kind of damaged, diseased leaves or stems so that they don't attract more pests. So really important. I want to just pause for a second to maybe ask if anyone is experiencing any insect pests that they want specifically addressed. And if not, we'll talk about some of our animal pests as well. Okay, well, feel free to enter in any questions as you go. I want to talk about one of the most effective ways that we can prevent animal and insect pests, which is physical barriers. Basically every vegetable farmer that I know of and gardener really should invest in some physical barriers. I really think that they're that important. And when I talk about physical barriers, I'm generally talking about what's referred to as row cover or fleece or remay. You can find them under a lot of different names. The brand name is, there's a few different ones. Agribon is the big one. Now, what I don't love about these is that they are spun poly fabric, so they are synthetic. Nonetheless, they are so important, and if you're careful with them, you can usually use them for many, many years. But they are fantastic. What they do is basically create a physical barrier against both animals and insects. So if you know that you're generally going to see an issue with, let's say, flea beetles or Colorado potato beetles, you might want to put this over your crop as soon as you plant it, whether it's seeding or transplanting, and cover it. What we usually do, I pulled this out today because, again, I noticed our woodchuck came by, and I want to give these sunflowers a really good chance to establish and grow up a little bit. When these are a couple feet tall, they're not going to be of much interest to a woodchuck. They're going to be too tough at that point. So I'm going to cover them today. And with sunflowers, they're quite strong plants. So I'm literally just going to cover them, and I'm going to put soil on both sides to weigh this down. And the sunflowers are going to push this up as they grow. For a more delicate plant, you might want to invest in something that's going to raise this off the ground so that it's not touching the plants. It does increase the temperature here as well. So keep that in mind. If you have a plant that does not like the heat, now is not the time to be doing this. Sunflowers really enjoy the heat though. So that is, I would say, one of the best and most important tools in our arsenal against both animal damage as well as a lot of insect damage. But I'm also gonna, I'm gonna stack some functions here. I'm gonna use a repellent as well. So aside from just using this physical barrier just to be on the safe side, we also occasionally use this repellent. It's called plant skid. Basically, really though, all it is blood. It's dry blood. That's a byproduct of animal processing. So it's something that you can buy commercially. And if you spray this on a plant, particularly before it becomes a problem, it really, really helps. So here it says for deer, rabbits, and elk. I found that it works for most herbivores. So it's really, really effective. And repellents in general are a great strategy. So there's a lot of different repellents you can use. For a lot of herbivores, anything that's going to signal that there are predators around will be effective. When you cut your hair, or if you want to get some from the barbershop, hair is a fantastic repellent for a lot of herbivores. So sprinkle that around any plant that might be experiencing some issues. Urine from predators, which you can buy commercially, comes dry. It doesn't smell at all. They often use, I think, coyote urine. I think there's even synthetic versions available. So that's something that you can invest in. It's another natural repellent. Often really fragrant, aromatic things are really useful. So examples of that would be soap. For some reason, was it Irish Spring? I forgot the name of the company. The really smelly soaps, if you hang those up, they tend to do a fairly good job against some deer. They're not going to be perfect, but they really help. Another really good aromatic is something like black pepper, chili pepper. Those are fantastic against smaller herbivores, primarily mice and voles. Burrowing animals in particular really seem to be deterred by some of those spicy aromatics. And certainly in the mint family, that's another great one. I often cut mint and we'll put it around plants that are being predated upon so that we can minimize that, because again, the smell is just a really good deterrent. But you really have to catch those early on, because once they get a taste for it, it's really tough. At that point, physical barriers are the way to go. And of course, fencing, which we haven't talked about at all, is very useful. We do not have a fence here, but it is a really important deterrent. And the fence type will really depend on what you are trying to exclude. If you're trying to exclude deer, you have to go 6 feet or taller, even 8 feet oftentimes. But 6 feet usually does the trick quite well. The other thing that I want to mention on the deer front in terms of exclusion, if you don't want to put up a big fancy fence, which can be very expensive, and also a bit of an eyesore, to be quite honest, the other thing that I found works really well is just putting a couple poly wires. So whether that might be twine, or it might be something more colorful, ideally, something that's really they're going to see. Usually I'll do a couple strands, maybe a couple feet apart, just between a few poles. And what I found is that deer hate the feeling of being entangled in anything. So if you can put a couple strands, maybe 2 feet off the ground and then 4 and 6 feet off the ground, they really won't want to enter that because they really don't want to feel like they're going to get caught in it. So that's something to keep in mind. And if you're looking for, rabbit fencing, one recommendation I want to make is not just including a fence along the ground, but also a fence along the bottom. So where a horizontal fence that's parallel to the ground, that's going out about 18 to 24 inches, because that will prevent animals from burrowing underneath your fence. And that can be quite a problem. So anywhere where you're going to be installing short fencing for groundhogs, for voles, for rabbits, I would also go along the ground, away from your garden, about 18 to 24 inches, because they won't be able to burrow where that fence along the ground is. So that's really important to think about when you think about fencing. So with that, I want to pause there, open up the floor for some Q&A. What's causing some problems for you? I would also love to hear if you have any great tips I know almost every gardener's got something that up their sleeve, some kind of tricks, certainly that I probably don't know about, maybe something you want to share with others on this Zoom session. So what's working for you? What's not working for you? What problems they're experiencing? Let's hear it. Let's share some wisdom. All right, so as we're waiting, again, if you have other any other questions or tips, please do feel free to write them. But otherwise, I think, let's see, how much time do we have left?
It's 11:50.
Okay. Otherwise, I'm happy to show you some other tips that we're working on here, other strategies that are working. But again, I really want to make sure that this time is useful for you all. So if there are issues that you're experiencing, I want to make sure that we address those first. But while I'm waiting, I want to show you a few other things that are right over here by us. So one other thing, and we talked about physical barriers. Another form of that right here, this is our blueberry patch. And I just wanted to show you what we do here. We covered this last week, right as the blueberries have already formed, but before they have ripened. We do have issues with birds eating our berries. And as much as I enjoy watching blue jays and even cedar waxwings come out and eat some of our berries, I really love blueberries. And that's one that I'm a little bit less willing to share quite as much of. So once these are ripe, we will uncover, we'll harvest, and then we'll recover. But this has been working fantastically to keep our birds away. And I do want to encourage that if you are having issues with birds. At home, I have a large cherry tree, which has been just, you know, I maybe get 10, 20% of the harvest, and most of the rest are eaten by robins in particular. And again, I do want to share, but maybe, you know, finding more of a balance is kind of what I'm looking for. So one thing that I've been trying successfully this year in terms of keeping birds away from larger fruiting trees is putting shiny objects as well as noisemakers in that area. And that's been doing a fairly good job. You can get a ribbon that's light attractive. So it's a sort of mirror-like ribbon that you can string around. And every time there's a breeze, it's going to catch the light and give off reflections. And I've been noticing that they're really frightened of that, right? Startles them. So that's been working quite well. The other thing that I've been trying to do is just take various objects that when the wind comes through, they'll make noise. So whether that's chimes or something even louder, those have been working really well. Any kind of noise that you can make that will startle away birds as well as other animals is really, really effective. I know some folks, I haven't tried this myself, but motion sensors that either give off noise or that start a water sprinkler have been found to be really, really effective scaring away animals. That works really well for deer as well. You know, a lot of us are really struggling with deer. Their populations are extremely high, especially in suburban areas. So I would really think about investing in some kind of motion sensor or sound creator that's going to startle them. I've been finding that to be probably the most effective strategy, along with fencing and physical barriers of various kinds. So, yeah.
Dan, one question that I have is I have some squirrels who, I mean, they've got so much else to eat right now in this boom year for acorns, but they've started eating my tomatoes as they've started forming.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we haven't had that issue here. We certainly, our squirrel population here is extremely high. And our chipmunk population is too. Our chipmunks ate actually a lot of our strawberries in the last few weeks. And this year actually seems to be an extremely high population year for chipmunks and squirrels in particular, because last year was a great year for both acorns and white pine nuts. So there's a lot of them around. They're thirsty and they're hungry. So yes, what do we do about it? Well, okay, so there's a few options. Actually, this is something I wanted to mention. I'm glad you brought up. One thing that I've been finding to be fairly effective is a homemade spray that I've been making, where I basically take garlic, whether it's the bulb or even the tops of garlic plants. Onion actually would do quite well too. I mix it with chili peppers, and I boil the whole thing for about 10, 20 minutes. I strain everything out. I add some soap in there, just some regular liquid soap. And what the soap does is it acts as a stickening agent, sticker. So it helps that spray attach itself to whatever you're spraying it on. And I take that spray, I put it in a handheld sprayer or a backpack sprayer, and I spray whatever I'm trying to keep herbivores away from. So I'm including squirrels, rabbits, woodchucks, deer. I haven't had too many issues with deer, so I haven't tried it yet with them. And it's been working really well. You do have to reapply it after rain. That's the thing. And you do want to get it on there early, because once they get a good taste for it, it's tough to deter them because they know where to go at that point, and they know that generally that is a good food for them. But if you catch it early or before it's a problem at all, that spray has been really, really effective for me. So using those aromatic agents, particularly anything in the garlic and onion family, chili family, the mint family, those are going to be really good against herbivores. The other thing that I would consider probably is some kind of fencing there. With squirrels, it's going to be a little tough, but certainly if you invest in something like this bird netting, this should do the trick. But you'll have to put some stakes up so that it won't smush the plants too much, and you'll have to figure out a way to attach it along the bottom, whether it's using soil or stones or sand, something that's going to weigh it down so that squirrels can't just go right underneath it. But squirrels don't tend to really burrow too much.
We have another question saying that it might be somewhat related, but this person has read that to encourage herbs to retain their nutrients, you should cut off the buds to prevent flowering. Is that really important? Would it be better to allow the flowers like thyme and basil to bloom to attract beneficial insects?
Right. Good question. So, it really, I would say this. So in general, when an herb flowers is when it's at its peak aromatic content. So if you're looking to dry it, let's say for making tea or a tincture or other medicine or as a deterrent, then wait for it to flower and cut it then. That's when it's going to be at its strongest. If you're looking to use it more as a culinary herb, you do generally want to cut it before it flowers. Usually when it flowers, it's already getting a little bit of bitterness in it. So that's not ideal for eating purposes. So if you are, again, it really depends on why you're cutting it. I definitely wouldn't take the time though to go through with an herb and take the flowers off, because first of all, they're going to flower very quickly. Once they start to get that into that life cycle of reproduction, they're going to be there no matter what. So you're not going to hold them off for too much longer. Plus herbs tend to have small buds. You're going to be using a lot of your time to try to take those buds off. So I would cut them close to the base, just above where the foliage is, and that new growth you can then harvest if you want it for culinary purposes. But again, if you're looking for medicine or to use it as a deterrent, wait for it to flower and then cut it right then. That's when it's going to be at its peak aromatic and essential oil content.
Great. We have time for one more question. So does anybody have a final question before Dan and Tyler add any final comments? All right, well, it doesn't look like we have any questions, and of course you're always welcome to send additional questions after we're finished. We're more than happy to answer questions as they come up. Dan and Tyler, do you have anything you want to conclude with? This has been amazing. I was frustrated that I couldn't hear for a little bit of the time, but everything, this was so useful. So if you want to say some final words.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick thing. First of all, thanks everyone for hanging out with us and listening to our little talk here. One resource that again we can send out, we can add it to our resource page to help with ID both with plant and insects is a source called iNaturalist. It's not a perfect resource, but it's a good start, really, if you don't have like a guidebook, because it actually it uses like, you know, real photos that people take to do real ID. So it's, again, it's not a perfect system, but it's a good place to start to help you sort of identify the things you don't know in your garden that could be a problem or might not be a problem.
Great.
Thank you, Tyler. So I want to just end with a few words. First of all, again, thank you for being here. I hope you all really see this topic as an opportunity to learn and to really realize just how little we know about what's happening around us. There's so much mystery. There's so much to learn. And I know oftentimes I get stuck in the feeling of, oh my God, something is eating this thing that I'm trying to grow. And it's so important to step back. And first of all, to really realize, first of all, you're creating food for something, right? And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, right? It's not just about feeding ourselves. We're ultimately part of this larger system. And really thinking of it as an opportunity to educate ourselves and to really learn and to become wiser and not just more productive, right? But really, I find so much wisdom when we slow down, when we start to watch these observations and enjoy them, right? We're here as gardeners, not just to produce and grow a bunch of food, and certainly that's wonderful too, but to enjoy the process of doing that. And if we're constantly in this mindset of us versus an enemy, you're not going to enjoy yourself, right? So step back, enjoy that process, realize that you're offering so much to the wildlife around you, and take that opportunity to really to thank yourself for what you're doing for your surroundings, for the greater picture. I want to make myself available as a resource to anyone who has specific questions. I'm happy to help you identify something, to think about solutions, and to just generally help in any way. So thank you all for being here. Hope you enjoy these beautiful summer days. Stay healthy, spend lots of time outdoors, and be good to yourselves and others.
Great. And I wanted to just also let everybody know that next Wednesday at 10:30, there is going to be a orientation training in the garden. So you're welcome to email us and let us know if you're interested in doing that. We're encouraging anybody who is interested in harvesting from the garden to take the training, so that there's a better understanding of what's there, but also a better understanding of when you'll know something is ready and how to properly harvest it. So feel welcome to do that. And also we look forward to having you join us for the rest of the series. So have a great day. Thanks everybody. Thanks Dan and Tyler and Keith for being on the other end of the camera. So take care everybody.